All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Samantha Levi, and as announced, I'll be presenting my completed master's thesis called Emojis as Indicators of Spatial-Temporal-Thematic Developments in Geosocial Media. Firstly, for a bit of background on this topic, the popularity of emojis has been ever increasing in the past decade, and as of 2022, over 22% of all tweets were published containing at least one emoji. And for those who aren't familiar, while normal social media data tends to be aspatial, geosocial media refers to posts on platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, and Flickr, where users have chosen to geotag their post, meaning that this data can be used in spatial analysis. From existing research in this field, we know that social media is a powerful data source, and as I just mentioned, emojis are an ever-increasing part of social media, and they offer an appealing alternative to text-based research because it allows us to avoid obstacles like slang or spelling errors and grammatical errors. And while there is existing research on emoji use within the realm of a single topic, and there's also research on social media data across topics that tends to be text-based, so this research really seeks to fill this existing research gap. Therefore, my research objective was to determine whether emojis could be used to identify relevant topics and their spatial temporal evolution in a non-topic specific dataset. This dataset consists of about 4 million tweets that were all geotagged within Europe during the year 2020 and contained at least one hashtag and one emoji. My three main research questions were, firstly, does the usage of emojis change over time and space? Second, do these changes have thematic connections? And finally, how can these developments be visualized? A quick look at my methodology. I used the four-facet structure of geosocial media as a conceptual framework. These four facets are temporal, spatial, topical, and social. And each of these facets corresponds with one attribute of my data set. However, here it's worth mentioning that it does raise some privacy concerns when you use sensitive information like user IDs, so I'll address that quickly. I did use the hyperlog algorithm to analyze this social facet, which is a cardinality estimator first and foremost, but does have privacy as a sort of side effect from this murmur hash function. I also used cryptographic hashing, spatial data aggregation, and visualizations at coarse resolutions to create sort of layers of data abstraction. My initial proposed workflow was a sort of straightforward iterative data analysis, but of course it was a master's thesis, so things got more complicated at some point. I ended up having these three main workflows that I'll walk through right now. Starting off with my hyperlog data analysis, as I mentioned before, it has some privacy awareness benefits, but really the main draw for me of this hyperlog algorithm was the ability to calculate cardinality for things like the number of distinct users, posts, and user days with a small margin of error. And I was also able to calculate unions, which, for example, allowed me to look at, for example, all of these arm emojis with different skin tone variations and perform a union so that they would all be considered as the generic form of this emoji. This cardinality estimation also helped me to reduce my reliance on absolute frequency, which also helped me identify emojis that are commonly used by bots or hyperactive users like spam accounts. The result of this hyperlog analysis was two lists that helped me to focus my research in the raw data analysis, which was much more exploratory. So I started off just by looking at the most frequently used emojis by month and also by country. But already here, maybe you can already notice we have some unusual or unexpected emojis in these lists that were the result of bots, so non-human users posting very frequently. So it's clear from that that absolute frequency is maybe not the best metrics to use in this case. Therefore, I turn to the typicality measure, which tells us for a designated subset of a larger data set, how characteristic or how typical of that subset is a given emoji. We can see that it's calculated as the normalized difference of relative frequencies. And we can look at typicality firstly across time. So for example, we can look at this masked face emoji, and above we have the absolute frequency and below we see the typicality. And while there seems to be a large difference in the number of uses of this emoji in March and April from the top graph, this is actually due to a gap in my data set. So in this case, it's much more informative to look at the spatial typicality rather than the somewhat misleading absolute frequency, and we can see that this emoji typically occurs in March, April, and May. We can also look at typicality across space. To do this, I created subsets by creating 100 by 100 kilometer grids and overlaying that over my study area. Here, I just made an example with the beer mug emoji and also the wine emoji. And if I flip back and forth between these two maps, you can already start to see some differences in the usage of these two emojis. So returning to my research questions, we see that yes, the usage of emojis does seem to change over both time and space. Moving on to thematic connections, I'll illustrate my point with these 4 most commonly used emojis. If we look at all of these emojis' temporal typicality, we see that it hovers around 0, which in this case tells us that these emojis are so commonly used that they don't typically occur within any one month. And more to the point, even if the thumbs up emoji, for example, was very typically occurring in May, that wouldn't really tell us that much since this thumbs up emoji has such a generic meaning and can be applied to almost anything. So for the purposes of my research, it was much more interesting to look at emojis that maybe had a more specific meaning, which leads me to my emoji-specific analysis. Taking this masked face emoji again, we want to see if it is topically consistent, if it refers to one specific topic in particular. And one way we can do that is by looking at the co-occurring hashtags. So it means that in posts that contain this masked face emoji, here we can see about 92% of those uses were used together with a hashtag that had to do with the coronavirus. Which helps to inform us when we look at the temporal typicality, for example. Not only are these 3 months times where this emoji is very typical, but also times where many of these COVID-related hashtags are typically occurring. And of course, we can apply that also to the spatial typicality maps. So that kind of answers my second research question. Finally, we can get into how these spatial and temporal changes can be visualized. One solution I came up with was a dynamic animation in which I used spatial temporal subsets to show the usage of the emoji over both time and space. Of course, we can also visualize these animations as static map matrices so that we can look at each month by itself. Looking over my results, I conducted that an emoji-specific analysis for some emojis that were predicted to have topical consistency, as well as emojis that were typically occurring within one of the 10 top countries by user days. I detected 3 kind of overarching topics. First, we have, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, the datasets from 2020. And we also have lifestyle and leisure topics, as well as activist movements. Just briefly going through my results here, we can see how these COVID-related topics are changing over time. Most of them spiked in March and April when the pandemic really took hold in Europe. Similarly, we have the hospital emoji. This clapping emoji was for healthcare worker appreciation. And In some cases, like for this raised fist emoji that was found to be topically consistent with Black Lives Matter, we can even see specifically around Paris in May that there was a very controversial Black Lives Matter rally being planned in Paris during the month of May, and even this specific event is reflected in the data. There were also elections occurring in Europe at this time. So for our overarching conclusions, we can see that yes, we found that emojis can be used to identify relevant topics and their evolution in a non-topic specific data set. Of course, there are some considerations there. For example, with topical consistency, some emojis are more meaningful than others. And we see that typicality in this case is a more meaningful metric than, for example, absolute or relative frequency. There are some privacy concerns as well to be aware of, and the HLL algorithm does have some limitations. I've provided here also some recommendations for future work, but with that, thank you very much, and I'm open to any of your questions or comments.